quite a bit. So first and foremost, I'd like us to understand what retrofitting is. Retrofitting is a part of a large spectrum of rehabilitation. So for you to say that something is retrofitting, you necessarily need to modernize a given building, incorporate new technologies, incorporate sustainable techniques in such a way that this is to create savings for those who are doing the intervention and understand what retrofitting is. Users, they don't need to be very old buildings. They have literature of buildings that are starting at 15 years old. They don't need to be historical heritage. They may be skeleton buildings that have been abandoned in cities. They might seek the change of use or not, but my research was based on the change of use from commercial to residential with the goal of flexibilization to try and prolong the use life of the building. And most importantly, it's important for us to know that retrofitting is not a renovation. You need to respect the essence of the building, because in that way, if you start fighting with already exists, then this will no longer be a financially sustainable renovation. So my work has a lot to do with ordinary architecture. What does that mean? This is a common architecture, day-to-day, trivial architecture, the architecture that we see, the most common architecture in the cities. So because of this, we must think as a society and as a class of professionals, what are we going to do with this large inventory of buildings that is accumulated in cities? So do the cities have space for this kind of architecture? So I have here a building in the center of the city of Belo Horizonte, which was retrofitted, but it wasn't able to be finished. It's from 2008. This was due to legal issues that interrupted the works. This often happens in retrofitting, and it's interesting for us to see. This is a well-known building in Belo Horizonte. It's known as the sways but doesn't collapse building, which is a Brazilian expression. And so this kind of building impacts around its surroundings and the city as a whole. So I invite you all to reflect about what already exists. And obviously, we can't help but think about the downtowns of different cities, because this is where we have the largest amount of real estate inventories, that buildings that are empty, that are unused, that need to have an intervention. For the geographic limits of my research, we use the so-called hypercenter of the city of Belo Horizonte. The hypercenter is in the center-south region of Belo Horizonte, which is the most expensive area in Belo Horizonte as far as the square meter goes. So these are regions in which the neighborhoods that are close to the center are very expensive, high-class neighborhoods. And so I'd like to also mention a citation by Weber, which is that we don't need to embrace or reject these metamorphoses that happen in the city. It's important for us to think about the forces that periodically transform the built urban environment. So what happens? Here, it's clear that retrofitting, in my research, it was clear that retrofit is related to the longevity of a given building. And this is conflicting with the culture of hurrying in the capitalist world and constant need to produce new products. Therefore, I think that my research fit very well in the research axes of the Praxis group, because it has, my question at all times had to do with who controls the city and who benefits from what inside a city. So my research started to progress in this issue, in this line of thinking, which is why not make a new product out of something that already exists? Since we're talking about the real estate market, let's forget about sustainability, the environment, and process economy. I'm going to focus on this issue of the product. So what was going on in Belo Horizonte? It already happened around the world and also in cities like Rio and São Paulo in Brazil. And then my research question was very much connected to the real estate market. Why is it that the real estate market was not interested in residential retrofitting in the center of the city of Belo Horizonte, and what was necessary for them to take interest? So we had two big challenges in the city, which is vacancy and obsolescence. So if we are able to solve both of them through retrofitting, why is it that this interest didn't happen in the market? So we have an inventory. I did a survey in Belo Horizonte. We know that it has a real estate inventory starting in the years 2000 when we have the plans for central areas. We started to have national plans for downtown areas. Belo Horizonte also started having specific laws seeking especially to do something about empty buildings in downtown Belo Horizonte and also seeking social interest. So there was a specific legislation, even though we can question that legislation as well and how it was done, how it was carried out. Retrofitting, through my cost survey, had a competitive cost and there was a demand for the product. All of the few buildings that were retrofitted for residential use downtown were sold very quickly. However, the civil construction market was not interested, and this was one of the things that I was thinking about. So my research axis is connected to retrofitted products with the downtown Belo Horizonte area because it has a different dynamic of other areas of the city. And of course, I needed to research the real estate market. What made the real estate market deny retrofitting so much? The survey that I carried out of the buildings, and even for this seminar, they asked us about the challenges we had as researchers. One of the challenges that I had is access to certain information that sometimes you're not able to get from the proper institutions, from the mayor's office, for instance. I didn't have the correct data for the buildings, so I had to base this on the Incipients platform and other previous studies. An entrepreneur also that works in downtown Belo Horizonte, and he gave us some tips and other helps. And I had 92 buildings that I detected. This can change or not. Sometimes there's a new building that comes in, or another one might be demolished or sold, but around 90. So these are some quick images so that we can understand a bit about what I've been talking about. These are skeleton buildings, abandoned buildings. We have both private and public buildings, which are in terrible state. Some are a little bit better preserved. So those are some examples. So what happened? In my research, I mapped from 2004 to 2019, and only 2 construction companies did residential retrofittings in the hypercenter. One did 3 buildings and the other one did just 1 building. So we have specific legislation and we have a public that sought these buildings. Not even with that, we had interest from construction companies. So for the time that we have today, my thoughts that I'd like to share is that retrofitting is inside a larger theoretical problem in relation to the economy or the production of space. And it's the power relations that will structure the practices of space production, this issue of renovating landscapes. When you're renewing spaces, you're creating new assets, and this dynamics of construction works was always based on speculation and obsolescence. So this is the way the products are articulated. And so something else that was very clear is that there's a systemic bias towards new constructions. So they used terms during my research that they didn't really want to do a product that wasn't starting from zero. So they even said that, oh, I don't feel like doing that. And so retrofitting is a part of the dynamics of the protagonisms of the real estate markets. It has different agents from the market, public agents. And so the agents will make choices, and sometimes these choices are divergent from each other. One might want to do something, the other one might not. Different agents will have different choices. And so in this way, I have a little diagram of the modus operandi of the real estate market. And I'm just going to do a quick outline of it, because during my research, I've been looking at the systemic bias towards traditional construction works and the land bank, which is really connected to the location and what possibilities you have for land bank for you to create new buildings. And when the market wants to launch a new product, they use inducive marketing, which they can make this product attractive to the market, to the consumers. And here I have a little bit of a discussion about the land banks, in which I realized during my work through the data that Belo Horizonte, the vast majority of the land bank belongs to private owners. And then you understand why is it that only a program like Minha Casa Minha Vida, the federal housing program that started in 2009, that's when you have this competition for retrofitting. Because with the Minha Casa Minha Vida program, a construction company could choose both how and where to build. So we had a huge growth during the same phase in the northern region of Belo Horizonte, where the state has less land and where companies and individuals have almost 90% of the land. And so one of the biggest competition with retrofitting was the responsibility of the Minha Casa Minha Vida housing program at the time, when we had a scenario, a national scenario, in which we could be talking about retrofitting of empty buildings. I didn't actually comment this, but I'd like to go back a second. These retrofitted buildings, they were not social interest buildings. We have two occupations in the hypercenter of Belo Horizonte, and despite the legislation mentioning conversion of empty buildings, we didn't have a single social housing retrofit project. So this was a public policy which was completely emptied of its purpose, at least of what it mentioned in the law. Something else that is interesting for us to think about
is demolition. We have to think about the systemic bias that goes towards demolition. If you look at the data for demolishing in Belo Horizonte between 2002 and 2017, City Hall authorized 1.3 demolitions at every day, and I did a more recent one. There were 1,007. A recent assessment between 2018 and 2022. There were 1,713 permissions for demolition. So the downtown area has become a gigantic area of house demolition for large buildings. This is another data set that for my research. So I was comparing new real estate versus old real estate. So we can see that there was a lot of new real estate. There's very little interest in the real estate market for retrofitting if they have places where they can build, especially in the metropolitan region. We have a huge, an increase of high class population in Nova Lima and Betim, Contagem, Santa Luzia, several cities. That is actually there was a competition where the city hall was talking about empty real estate. I can conclude that the financial market, the first thing that they're interested in is location. So the central locations are very valued in Brazil. They're always going to want to build. They want the metropolitan region. Probably, maybe retrofitting is of interest if there is scarcity in the metropolitan area. And that's second moment, we might be able to go back to those central areas in the attempt to preserve those areas instead of demolition. So retrofitting, the situation will be more favorable to retrofitting if there is less vacant land or demolishable land. So there are several reflections that stem from my work. I'd like to draw attention to a few of them because I think it's important that we understand to question the issue of the culture of renovation. There has to be a balance. Those cities that grow more slowly, they're more open to diversification. Belo Horizonte has a history of a lot of demolition, a lot of change in our landscape of the city. So what I think is that City Hall, the city government should monitor the inventory, and they will have to be able to control the issue of the spread of the city. One of the things that people were very upset about was specific legislation. Well, yes. So the city government needs to debureaucratize and maybe implement public policies that attract small and medium scale entrepreneurs. Also, it's important to talk about a progressive property tax. Maybe this might be an important thing to start so these vacant lots are used, or sorry, these vacant buildings are used. I'd also like to talk about the role of academia in showing to students the possibility that exists, because that is what will face a city that is built with an inventory that needs to be reused. And I'd like to share a work that was shown in a conference, PFLEX 2021, the Arquiteto conference. It's called the architectural interventions from the reading of the place. This was an area that was abandoned, and some students reread the space, looking at that building. And the really interesting thing that we noticed, that some people are a little, you know, the students sometimes do a double take when they're asked to work on a building that already exists. But we were surprised by the quality of the work. There was a big diversity of proposals, and it shows the possibility of this building, that the students had this projected intervention, how it contributed to the urban space, because they had to intervene not just in the building itself, but in the whole environment around it. It was a really interesting piece of work by academia. And this is what students, when they become professionals, will face. There is an existing inventory, and which needs to be replaced in the dynamic of the city. That's it from me. I thank you for the opportunity in closing up my my presentation, and I'm open to questions from you guys later. Thank you. Congratulations on your presentation. Let's go ahead with Rodrigo Rocha de Freitas' presentation, and we'll come back to the questions after the presentations are done. Good afternoon, everyone. In my presentation is based on my research that I had during my master's advice, and my advisor was Denise. I'm not going to talk for too long about the strategies and the case study. I'm going to talk a little more about the conceptualization and the conclusion and next steps. If you're interested, you are welcome to check out my dissertation, and also in the text that's going to be published after these the Praxis webinar. I focus on the dwelling as my unit of analysis because it's a generic human demand. Whatever society exists, but dwellings are necessary, and dwellings have been necessary and emerge as different in different are different in different moments. So although they're generic, there are specific effective manifestations. I use the term determinations. I think of determination not in a deterministic approach, not a teleology of the production of space as a space that's a given, but it's thinking about what is given as the possibilities that give us availabilities for what we build. And this understanding gives us more agencies. The dwelling also gives us an articulation between different scales, from the collective to the individual. There are multiple determinations, and thinking about these multiple determinants allow us to interact with different kinds of people. So thinking about, I focus on residential buildings in my work. So this is the hegemonic way of production in our urban spaces. So unfortunately very rigid and repetitive, and the dweller, the resident, is being alienated from the process because of the overvaluation of economical determinants. So instead of the idea of the building as a continuous process with a symbolic involvement of the resident with his dwelling, the dwelling is diminished to a commodity. His agency is very limited by these economic determinants. So it's very important to rethink about this role of the architect, because that classically it's just the translation of the hirer's interests into a work order. This reduces the possibilities of transformation. So I suggest the construction of space as a process. It's less verticalized, it's less elitist. In our understanding of architecture as process, we connect the time and space, so it has its historical character, its connection to the environment in which it is placed, and especially the people who will intervene in the process of construction, of production, what kind of techniques, what kind of constructive culture. This makes possible the amplification of forms of production, so the architect is not subjected just to the aesthetic domain demands of the market. So the architect is able to have a focus on. It's important to have a focus on materiality and a rearrangement of the forces amongst the agents, so that different agents are able and different stakeholders are able to intervene in the space depending on their interests. Also, this is very linked to the support theory. To design for the future, for determinations that we do not know about, it's really important to take uncertainty as a premise, but we need to organize this in categories so we can translate the working with uncertainty. So I worked with the concepts of flexibility and adaptability. We need to separate these two contexts. Flexibility is the possibility of working with the physical transformation capacity of the built space, and adaptability, the ability to serve different social uses.
So you have these different techniques and functional uses, or even the change of demand for the same use, or in other cases, we have the change in social use where we don't need a transformation of the physical space. The same arrangement can have a different use. It's also important to think that these properties of a building are potential properties as well, in the sense that they only manifest themselves on the demand of the users and residents where there's a physical potential for the use. So you have the material feasibility to actually carry out a new demand of a use. So in order to work with these design strategies, we needed to understand the concept of design strategies that went beyond the formal attributes of a given building, the formal artifacts, in the sense that the logic, the thinking, the paradigms that are used, the mechanisms that are used interfere in the result, because sometimes the same spatial arrangement have a different degree of flexibility in the sense that you think about the kinds of connections between their elements, the possibilities of various possibilities of use without necessarily affecting the final usage. In this sense, I did a survey and a reorganization of a variety of different strategies that had been organized by other actors that manifest themselves not always linearly or causally. And it's also important to think about how ordinary architecture ends up being excluded from the literature, in the sense that the most of the examples that we learn from are important buildings from important architects. So the application of these design strategies aren't prescriptive. So we can have a flexible, adaptable design as well. So it's necessary to understand these different determinations to apply strategies that are adequate. So we had three main axes that I'd like to present. We have flexibility or polyvalence, indeterminate, something that's not determined, and prefabrication. So we'd have the relation between a building and the city, breaking the border of a building and the city. But I didn't actually present this in the dissertation because this is an axis that was a little bit too outside of the case studies that I had. So this was outside. Polyvalence or flexibility, when we understood as a kind of strategy that is adopted to allow for a variation of use without, however, changing the form. We maintain the form. The form is still defined by the architect, but it is possible to change the use according to the prescriptions of the form, or even more freely based on other strategies. This axis was divided between machines for living, minimum units, and the legibility of shapes. The machines for living was a modernist approach that had a correlation between machines and housing. So variation of use was the adaptation of the shape that was already prescribed, in which we had panels and retractable and mobile furniture. So a same space that we have a day-night logic, so that we can have different uses for the same space during the day or the night. Whereas minimum units, they join to this logic of the machines for living a collectivization of other uses of the building, like kitchens, etc. So since these specialized units are not inside the units, these areas can be more generic and reduced. But this logic for minimum units can also lead to the precarization of these areas. The legibility of shapes on this way is more connected to Dutch constructivism, which is described by Hertzberger, and it talks not about the shape changing throughout time, but of creating a shape that's not formally specialized. So they use ergonomic and visibility principles and separation in different levels of privacy to guarantee that people can use the space in a variety of different ways. Indetermination, on the other hand, has to do with strategies that enable changes in arrangement, physical and usage changes based on a minimum infrastructure that might potentialize these different transformations. To do so, you design integrated spaces with less obstacles and less internal compartments, spaces that have surpluses, like surpluses in sewage, electric installation, opening, so that you can have different layouts and physical arrangements. And also to have hard cores for stairs, for instance, so that you can also enable these arrangements. So you need to differentiate these constructions from a generic minimum construction, in the sense that they have the minimum conditions for habitation, they need to be organized in such a way as to enable a variety of different uses. So they are not as generic and restricted. They are thought of based on the place and on the determinations of that place. And prefabrication is an axis which does not necessarily have to do with any prefabricated element, but mechanisms and ways to operate the typical elements of this type of production, like modular coordination and connectivity. When you have modular coordination between the different elements that make up the space in a modular area through which the space is edited, you have the possibility of reorganizing these elements in different ways, especially if the connection between the different elements is thought of beforehand in such a way as to make it easier to take them apart and put them back together. Another topic in this axis has to do with support and infills. We have the Otenbeard movement, which is organizing buildings based on fixed elements that guarantee their transformation. And then you have light transformable elements. Each resident can choose to change as needed. And then we have organization in layers so that you can have different life cycles and different use of their components in such a way that you can enable that maintenance or substitution of smaller components that are more easily that run into obsolescence more easily, so that the building is better used for a longer time. So for case studies, I have 4 contemporary apartment buildings in the city of Belo Horizonte, and I chose these buildings in the sense of they're not just a repetition of the modernist building that we see exhaustively reproduced in the city. These buildings, they catch our attention because they are based on aesthetic difference. They are highlighted in the landscape because they're different. And the architects who proposed these buildings, who designed these buildings, were the ones who proposed the buildings. There was one case, however, when a future resident was the one that proposed the building, and they hired the architect. So we have a dilution of economic determinations to other priorities and determinations such as aesthetic and theoretical architectural determinations. And so the flexibility and adaptability were held as assumptions, as premises. But however, due to aesthetic and functional determinations, some of the strategies that were adopted without these intention, but their collateral manifestations actually guarantee a more flexible and adaptable space. In these case studies, I could also see that they didn't use any kind of strategy based on prefabrication. All of these buildings were made more in a more traditional artisanal manner. There was a lot of resistance in builders in adopting a larger variation, where they would need a more qualified workforce. There's the maintenance of the hegemonic forms of production, such as the tripartite division of the units. Even though we have units on the building in the Estúdios Capelinho, they're not compartmentalized. That's the case in the other ones. This aesthetic distinction was incorporated into the market discourse, so it's like an added value for the product, for housing. However, when we're talking about residents and looking at the project, we didn't actually see any major transformations or changes of use. Sometimes this has to do with residents not having the technical knowledge on the possibilities of transforming the space they live in. There was a case of a resident that sought me after she read the dissertation to thank me because she didn't even know about the possibilities of transformation that her apartment had. Oftentimes, these restrictions come from the modality in which a person is in the building. So if they're renting a unit, they don't feel comfortable changing it too much. And sometimes you have the satisfaction with the product that's offered. People don't necessarily conceive of other ways to look at it, and they build their necessities based on what's sold to them. In these cases, we have a huge limitation on how to think of these different ways of living in a given space, which also made me think about whether this has to do with the kind of public that consumes the buildings that I analyze, which is a higher middle class public. Maybe if we looked at housing formed for less hegemonic groups or marginalized groups, we might find a larger variation of demands. So as for the next steps in my research, I think about studying examples of non-hegemonic collective initiatives to expand the discussion on the types of production, especially about economic dynamics, to understand how these determinations incide on our projects, and also to actually apply the research, both designing and teaching. It's very interesting to see when theory faces an actual design exercise, we start understanding new determinations or new biases that we had not even noticed, and how when teaching, especially design, we learn so much with our students. At least that's what I realized and had when I had the opportunity to collaborate with Denise in the design classes. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo. Congratulations for your work. Now we're going to continue on to our third presentation, which is going to be presented by Carolina Boaventura. Carol, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Fernando. I'm going to share my screen. Pode ser. Acho que eu vou cortar a unha do Godot.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this event, and to be, for this event for a research group that is part of my history and my training. I'm going to start talking about my training. I built this diagram to discuss the importance of praxis and also the relations that are part of this process of construction of Carolina, myself, as an architect and an urban designer. I went to school at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and was a member of the Praxis research group. And from the experiences that Praxis allowed me, I was a part of architectural firm, and all of these relations of these lived experiences, they make me who I am today. And this brings me also to what I advanced in my master's course. So what I am presenting today is based on my master's research in the Federal University of Minas Gerais. The name of my work is Project Diagrammatic Processes, and I was advised by Professor Denise Morado. So I've brought new experiences after my master's work. And before I start off with that, I'd like to contextualize what I am calling project diagrammatic processes of project processes, sorry. My work understands diagram, that which is designed, that which is drawn. Throughout history of the architecture, we've had different roles in the practice of professional projects. Starting off from the 20th century, studies in the field of engineering indicated the possibilities of diagrams. Here we see these illustrated. These diagrams were already suggesting fluxes of movement, and they were central in modern architecture, promoting ideal movement throughout the space. So here we see a bad example of flux of movement. Here we see a diagram that brings conflict. And the second one here to the right is less conflict in the internal flux. In contemporary architecture, this idea of diagram has become amplified, and it brought together different information, often based on advanced software with some major architectural firms with parameters. Here we see, so in this universe of architecture, in the history of architecture, we have several important names in the discussion of the use of diagram in the project process. And we have advances in relation to modernism, from a functional to a processual diagram that inserts other informations beyond the function of the space. And we start to see the possibility of viewing, if we're talking about the practices of projecting spaces and places, the possibility of bringing the information from the place into the process of projecting. So through the diagrammatic design processes, we bring not just form and typology, but principles. We start from looking at the place in this universe of architects. I bring some world-renowned architects and their strategies that they bring, and I bring professors Denise Morado and Juliana Torres, who work in the courses. They work diagrammatic design processes. They really think of the process aspect of the projects. My master's research started from analysis, observation, and follow-up of this strategy of teaching processes, especially through Denise Morado's approach, trying to organize and discuss the process that I was a part of as an undergraduate student under Denise Morado and Juliana Torres at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. This work attempts to synthesize and discuss, narrate these experiences and trying to understand what kind of advancements was made. In this context, the diagram starts out from the information of the place and information on social relations. They're all aligned in the production of space in contemporary society. And we have to understand, in my dissertation, we discuss these processes of the project They happen in a space which is social informational because it includes the actions themselves of the people in the place. The actions are informed by information which generate action. In this space, which is social informational, the space is a product of the action of the past. It is a medium of the action in the present, and it's a condition for the action in the future. What was the action of the past is the product of what we have today, form the product of what we have today, and we act on the space and currently, and it is a condition for the future. Another important point is the information. It gives shape, it shapes the relations between objects, contents, and subjects. And there are layers of information of the action in space and time are understood as place attributes of the place, which give potency or limit the actions according to the strategy of the project that is organized by the relation between attributes, action, and place. So we think of the attributes, the issues that are physical, for example, shade, sun incidence, altimetry, actions, what people do in a space, collectively or individually, and then the representation of this information in place, which is a big difference. So there's something that I really remember, a sentence that I really remembered during when I was doing my project course. Is saying that we work with in the diagram proposal is that when we diagnose, we work from text to design. In the diagram, you work from design to design or from drawing to drawing. So the diagram is a part of the project, and it begins to change as we insert information as a strategy of conduction of this diagrammatic process. We start to collect information. We categorize what we have collected because there's a universe of a lot of information which needs to be organized, and then we represent it. We start with a basis. It could be bidimensional, tridimensional. It's important that we have these bases with multiple scales and dimensions because we are able to insert more and more information. So starting with data collection, category building, then we create the representation of the place. And with the representation of the place, we start to superimpose and actions, for example. So we have to understand the physical attributes that will allow or limit, for example, the action of sitting. So for example, if it's a place that is shaded, we know that that's positive. So if we know that in that place we have shade, there's potential. We have to think about other attributes that are relevant for this action. Is there a beautiful view for this action? Are there issues of safety? Issues of access? So I have to map out these attributes that will have a positive impact on that action. And also I start noticing as I start to cross these categories that I can see actions, different actions that are made potentialized by different attributes. So if I am projecting a public space that is a place for sitting, we can also maybe in that area they can sit, they can play, they can lie down. There are different actions. So we have to think about what kind of equipment that we're going to put in that place that will allow for and permit different actions. So the process works naturally through the drawing process. So this is a process that goes way beyond the normal typologies, the more traditional. So first I started off as new experiences that I bring since my master's program as a professor in the architecture and urban design in the Centro Universitário UNA. So I noticed that some issues, some questions repeated themselves. For example, in the initial difficulty in the courses that I was a part of, students were initially had a hard time understanding, and they wanted to have traditional, beautiful diagrams. They were more concerned with the aesthetics of the diagrams. But, and then we had to deconstruct this. So this was deconstructed in my mind during the master's, and that's why we're talking about process-oriented diagrams. So the important thing was not to present the end product of a process, but to conduct the process. So this process needs to communicate. But at this moment, it's important that each student uses the diagram that makes more sense to them, that's easier for them. If they're going to use a software, if they're going to do a hand design, if they're going to use 3D representation. When I started in the UNA Center, I gave them initially a theoretical presentation about diagrammatic processes so that they could experiment upon the reading of the plays, understanding that the reading of the plays is subsidized by the collection of information, and then this leads to diagrams, and then analysis and superimposition of the categories of use. Students had a hard time in the beginning.
without actually evaluating the issue. And we understand that in the space, we must create different possibilities of appropriating the spaces more than just solutions. And so we have solutions here which are very general. Sometimes I'd say to students that these are basic issues, like having quality sidewalks, having shadows, having good lighting. This isn't what happens in our city, but it should be the basic. This is the basic for any urban design. You must look at sidewalks, crosswalks, shadows, lighting. So what else could we have? Should we have an open stream that's channeled, and then maybe we should have in the project some kind of crossing to reconnect two neighborhoods which weren't connected due to this channeled stream. So this group presented this project. The class was interrupted, just like the master's degree. And then, since they looked at the problem of connection, they tried to understand how to reconnect, and they started to explore the idea of what the actions were when they were proposing the urban furniture and equipment. And so they went further in depth in their proposal. They redid their work, and in a way which was still preliminary, they understood the different flows in this map. They understood the different flows and the connection with the bus stops, the corners, the different pedestrian crosswalks, and they started to define the project, identifying these characteristics of that place. So we have internal designs that had to do with the needs of prioritizing these connections, and also the exploration of the different equipment. These were students in their fourth semester. And so in the play areas, they started to investigate playing beyond just the traditional toys. They started investigating other possibilities, something that both adults and kids can enjoy. So their process reached much more interesting results, and it was very positive. And out of the groups that I brought, there were two groups with 4 students, and 5 students decided to do their final undergrad papers with me. And this went, and when I was doing this counseling, we're always looking at process-based strategies. So we have this student looked in a processual way at a cultural a proposal for a cultural project. So that we have different axes, we have all the different facades, and this is the project itself, the shape. But it started from an understanding of the place and looking at how this equipment could be best installed and implemented. And I have a park here. The student also understood, especially the flows and the areas with the largest demand. And so the park was designed with its paths and with different connections and the areas that should be appropriated. Here we have some more images of her work. It's a project that really has the necessary connections for the place. I think the image already tells us a little bit about that. And there's an implementation of the use throughout these path as a way to increase the appropriation of the population. So beyond the experience as a teacher, the seminars that I gave about diagram processes was very interesting. Something else that was very important that I thought was a positive experience and that added a lot was a diagram design process workshop in which we had an experiment. We proposed, this was a workshop where we had some information that was previously defined with actions for the students to work at crossing the different informations and actions, reaching their project. Since it was a very short period, we didn't actually produce diagrams, but we have some pictures of the workshop and a little bit of the process the students were working. And what was really interesting in the workshop was understanding that just speaking isn't enough. It's important to experiment, and it's necessary to articulate practice and theory. And so in my experience in offices and as an autonomous architect, in the offices, I realized that oftentimes the information of the place are not determinant for the design of the project. We have economic pressures, economic issues, legislation. They're the ones that are most important in the decision-making process for our clients in an office, if compared to the information of the place. But even then, the diagram really helped us in understanding the legislation this is a project in my office where we had a lot of different legislation limits, and we were only able to understand what we could do in an annex to a building. We were only able to understand this by modeling all of the different restrictions. So through modeling, we were able to actually see what this annex building could be like using the existing areas. And today, since I'm public sector architect as well, I still use this logic of diagrams and superposition of information in urban design projects, which was what I actually work in my day-to-day life. But one of the premises and one of the main goals of my master's research which is still pending for investigation because I haven't actually been able to do it, which is the insertion of other agents in this diagrammatic processes, both in professional practice and in teaching. The insertion of other agents beyond the architect we've been having some problems because of the initial difficulties of students. And so sometimes we don't have enough time for students to insert other agents. And in the public sector, we have a hard time in engaging and involving the population in a process that isn't real yet, which is just an attempt to get the funds. And in traditional offices, we still have these different priorities. So based on these limitations that emerged in our experience, in our professional practice, we identified the challenges and potentials in my master's research. I lived them once again. And so I realized that there's a necessary articulation between theory and practice when teaching diagrammatic design processes. If we don't have that, this is slowly lost. And there's also a need to publicize this, to talk to other professors so that this logic can be replicated in different parts of the course, in building projects. Changes in legislation brought different demands and possibilities. And in urban projects, we have this capacity and potential of reading the place and bringing all of these techniques to the project itself. But we've been having a hard time inserting other agencies. In this sense, I think the Praxis research group studies seem very positive throughout the years, and as a space in which we can better understand and see information that come from other agents without necessarily having to contact them. So I think these are my main experiences in my work, and I'd like to thank you for being able to share a little bit about this. And I'd also like to thank everyone for learning, for giving me the opportunity to share and to learn. And thank you. Thank you, Carolina, for your presentation. It's great to hear you and to contact you. It's been a few years since you were a part of our office. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to make a few quick comments. I'm going to try and direct them and more some things to think about for each, so that each person can also advance a little bit in this conversation. They're not really questions, but they're things to think about. And I'd also like to bring a few references which I think are fundamental in these discussions that you were mentioning. So to start, I'd like to say, in relation to Maura's work and Rodrigo's work, but I think it also dialogues with Carolina's work, I'd like to remind you all of the experience of the French office of Anne Lacanton and Jean-Philippe Marçal. This couple was recognized last year with the Fritzo Architecture Award, maybe the main architecture award, internationally speaking. And it recognized the trajectory of this architecture firm throughout the decades. And maybe the common denominator between the different projects is this obsession with the preservation of material goods and pre-existing built spaces, which notably is presented in the large renovations they made of housing buildings from the post-war period in France, which ended up creating a highlight with the use of existing spaces as a material for architecture in the works of this office. It's much more common for us to recognize architecture that emerges out of a creation in an empty lot, or where we don't have anything existing or dealing only with the pre-existence of their surroundings. But this firm has a very important discourse and a very important reference for the work of Maura and also for Rodrigo, in the sense of this. Well, for Maura's work, well, first because it points to what I understand as being a crucial issue of her work beyond the idea of retrofitting, or what this specific concept represents.
mainly to what she points towards a second phase of the understanding in this research, which is what comes out of this in the occupation of the city, in the transformation and building of the city. So having the option to not demolish is very central as a position, a form of action. I think that there is a strong relation of this office with Maura's work. And in relation to, and it's also in relation to Rodrigo's work, is how they try to favor the existing projects, existing building. What do they work into? How do they work in terms of the area around it? So thinking about addition instead of subtracting parts, adding parts. So this goes beyond the discourse of retrofitting, but I think this is really important because the idea of free space, not unprogrammatic space, which doesn't respond to a pre-planned use, which allows the dweller to invent a use according to how life goes along. So finally, Carolina, I was reading a bit about them, Lacaton and Vassal, this architecture firm. So I discovered that Anne Lacaton has a teaching philosophy, teaching method. I couldn't get a lot of information about it, but I think it's interesting to research this because she says that she organizes her teaching around spatial fragmentation in such a way that each reading of the fragment of the space is able to bring about a sensitive reading of forms of use, potentials of use for that work, for that building and project. So they have this idea of thinking about the project from the outside in, which is not usual amongst us architects, but also to think about the areas of how they will be used, how they will look outside, how they will relate to the space. I think that's a first reference that kind of weaves across these three presented works here. In terms of Maura's work, I wanted to reflect on the reading that her research work brings. It brings a very clear understanding of the state of this occupation, of the vacant buildings in the city center that are really underutilized, especially in terms of social interest actions. But the project really highlights it doesn't show us a lot what could happen in those spaces. It's obvious to us architects that this area would be revitalized or vitalized if we could give life to the downtown, guarantee a flux of people in different areas, reduce this urban sprawl, concentrate in the use of the areas that are available, equate the housing deficit with these areas that are, with these buildings that are available. All of this is so natural. When you present the work, the counterpoint in terms of the difficulties that are presented by the building developers, it's important to seek an understanding within this perspective. So those are 3 points that we could start reflecting. One is an architect from Minas Gerais, Jorge Tanuri. He's an individual, but he has an action. He works within this segment he's worked within this segment for 15 years. He's designed projects, and he's also worked with these renovations in Belo Horizonte downtown. He has done renovations in 15 to 30 places. In one of the buildings, he practically redid all the apartments. Maybe there were 2 exceptions because the property owners didn't sell. Jorge has his mode of action is rooted in commitment with quality, independent of the scale. And he's, if you think of the scope of his work, of the years, he's worked in a mode almost like an experimental laboratory mode. He has experimented with different scales, from minimal scale with shared usage, and others with larger apartments, which reminds us of the Lacatan and Vassal, so smaller bedrooms and more open areas, larger open areas to diverse kinds of occupations. So he might be out of the curve, but he might be an interesting figure to look at, to shed light for other architects. I mean, he makes his living out of this. He has a lot of demand. He has an increasing demand. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the Fika Fund. It's a fund created by architects in São Paulo. Special highlight to Simone Gatti. I'm blanking on the name right now of the other architect. They founded a fund, this fund that has a social interest. They fundraise to buy real estate in São Paulo downtown, in the São Paulo downtown area, and they offer these with controlled rent, with low cost rent, to be able to serve the low income population in the downtown of São Paulo. So this is an interesting way of subverting the logic. And of course, we can't be amiss in mentioning the occupations. Maura also commented on the occupations. I think it's really important for us to remember that Brazil took to the 7th biannual meetings of Venice was the utopia of the commons. They took the experience of the Carolina Maria de Jesus settlement / occupation as a message of utopia, of how these spaces can be occupied in differentiated manners than those that are submitted to market forces. So these things also dialogue with Rodrigo's research work. I thought it was really interesting when he said at the end of his presentation, this is something I wanted to comment, Rodrigo, when at the end you talk about taking your investigation to other arenas of, not where you researched, but to more vulnerable, marginalized areas where we know that there are modes of dwelling that are very distinct, especially when we address flexibility, adaptability. I think the favelas, the shantytowns uh, are are very important to research. They're I like to think that the favela presents itself to us architects as an arena for a lot of learning for us. Um, Unlike that we normally think of the problems of the favela, but we can have a more delicate glance at the favelas, and learn from them. And then I can mention a bit more when I talk about the Carolina occupation. So I have two considerations for you. One, reaffirming and recommending that you guide your view to these territories, your research to these territories, and also in relationship to Maura's work. How does your research, how it can be viewed through the rehabilitation, not just the construction of new buildings. So those are things I would like to bring to your attention and reflection. Carolina, I think this is a theme. The themes that you bring of the processes of representation, the idea of diagrams, not just as a representation, but as an interface that is process oriented, that allows communication and social interaction. It's so important to the project. This is always concerned us. We've always tried to be in a process of understanding, and I think it's impossible to have a unique method. Even when we work in the Aglomerado da Serra region, which is very free, which has been we've done a lot of that in the last 5 years in an intensive manner. We notice that each case for each case, it's warranted to have a unique approach. We might be doing now, for example, 3 housing projects, but they can be very different. Maybe the motivation for a house is different. For example, in one case, it's an emergency for the house, and another one is desire of having like a dream house. This has the idea, of what an architect can bring to a house. And then the last case, somebody who doesn't need a house and is able to do something that is different. And even in the financing issue, and also in terms of the proposal, there are this distance view. Maybe they might look like the same, but when we approach the projects, they have their subtleties and specificities.
I had a work experience. I'm going to mention 2 different work experiences of mine that might contribute to your research. They have a lot to do with the issue of understanding the place, the people, their needs, but also their understanding of their values, which sometimes are hidden and must be revealed. We can't necessarily access these values if people don't reveal them to us. So I worked with two different groups. One of them is an office firm from the Netherlands, both in Amsterdam and London. And it's created by a couple of designers. It's called STBY. And they work in this field of design research. Design research applied to processes, applied to product creation processes, or they also work with architecture processes, urbanization processes. So this group, they have a wide variety of tools which go way beyond graphical support. And this is what I wanted to highlight to you. I think you might want to research their work a little bit. They use a complex array of tools, one of which that I had the opportunity to work with them in a project in a school in London is what they call design documentaries. They create small video documentaries, short video documentaries with the people who participate in a given scene or situation of a project. And oftentimes they leave the cameras so that the residents themselves, or in this case, the students, in the case of the school, can make their own short documentaries revealing layers that are a lot more subtle than those that a designer can access, or which other processes can access. So in my opinion, diagrammatic processes can be associated to a series of other processes, and should be, in my opinion. In our specific case, in the Aglomerado da Serra neighborhood, I think what has favored the recent work that we've been carrying out over the last 5 years is exactly entering the logic of oral culture, living the space beyond our work, establishing other effective connections and links to the place, to the different events and different moments that are not just work moments, and exploring these conversations, these meetings. So this opens up a whole new field, which to me completely transformed everything that we do, everything we intend to do. A second and final example, so that I can finish up my participation, I think I've gone a little bit too long already, is our work, which took place around more than 10 years ago with the Co-Natural firm, a Colombian firm, which has in its origins, of its way of thinking and acting, a very big connection between landscape and architecture. And they understand landscape in its wide meaning, that is everything that exists, all of the different occupations of that given landscape, all the different life forms in that landscape, in which architecture or urban intervention will affect in architects' work. So I think they have very interesting work in their way of reading the landscape, and how this actually takes place through design and representation, always seeking to include these environmental aspects. Where does the water go through? How does the population of a given territory use the water? What are the paths of the water through the territory? How is the soil related to the infiltration of this water? How does this create the presence of a given type of vegetation? So this whole relationship of a landscape with the constructed environment, and this is very important in all the different representations and end up informing an architecture which is also committed to environmental and social issues in a given territory. As I mentioned, I wasn't really asking questions. I just wanted to bring all these comments that might contribute to the future of each one of your work. Congratulations. Thank you, Praxis, for the invitation. Maculan, I'd like to thank you immensely. Even though you don't have questions, it was great to hear what you said. I'm sorry to interfere with the conduction, but Rodrigo needs to go to the airport. So first, I'm going to open the floor to him and then to Maura and Carol. And I'm going to put a question in the chat that you should ask to after Rodrigo speaks. Thank you so much for your comments, first and foremost. The French office really is a huge reference for project design. So when we're talking about the occupation of buildings, this is something that I've been researching in a study with Professor Carolina Moraes. And what we've seen through the study is that the cycles of accumulation of capital demand an expansion of markets that lead to new cycles of primitive accumulation. And so the city always tends to expand instead of concentrating, because beyond the increase in the number of housing projects, this expansion leads to an increase in infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. So there's other sectors beyond the real estate market that benefit from the expansion of the city. That's why I think it's so hard to intervene in this cycle of expansion, because there tends to be some kind of regulation from the state so that we have the requalification and renovation of these downtown areas. And a lot of what we did in this research was to show how this obsolescence discourse is completely out of whack, because the market uses this discourse to empty these buildings and promote an expansion of the city, when we actually show that through simple strategies we can requalify these spaces and make them habitable again. We can see how this discourse actually goes into this logic of expansion. But yes, the buildings that we have, even the PFlex, which I corroborated with a few times with Denise, we say that students should appropriate empty buildings. And we see that many of them, like the one that Maura mentioned, which is a modernist structure, there's a high quality of space. There's lots of opening. They have facades with little functional determinations. They have freestanding pylons. So it would be very interesting for us to better be able to use these underused spaces and promote this discussion to adopt another logic. And maybe urban occupations might be the best way to actually reuse this this building. I see that Marina is here. I think that we should look at how we can guide these occupations and how to occupy these buildings in a more productive way. Even, getting to know which buildings have the highest potential for occupations. As for my research going further into styles that are less hegemonic, the favelas are really a great thing to study. And there's also a place where we have a lot to learn from, because there's a lot of knowledge. I'm not trying to romanticize the precarious living, but this precarious nature often brings new knowledge, which is not formally codified in the way that architecture tends to incorporate this kind of knowledge. But yes, in a certain way, this flexibility and adaptability, they are a lot more viable when the units are independent, in the sense that when each person has their own home, their own unit, the difficulties of transforming the space are not as large as when you have a collective use building, because you don't have facade conflicts, floor conflicts, structure conflicts. And so sometimes I think that my research could be more about how to promote collective housings for populations that cannot access housing through consumption. So maybe having self-management of construction works. The Minha Casa Minha Vida housing project had a model for entities that is non-financial, non-commercial entities, but the way that they actually finance things in the program really made it a lot easier for big construction firms. I don't know if I can go ahead and answer Marina's question because I won't be here later, but I can see that, yes, the laws operate in favor of the market logic. And what really caught my attention is how the market operates inside the legitimization of a specific way of life, which values this kind of way of life. Rodrigo, sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's important for me to read the question so that those people who are reading, who are watching us without access to the question, can actually understand your answer. Okay? So Marina Sanders asks, do you think that the determinations of legislation limit the project design processes? Up to which point are they positive and necessary? And up to which point are they mirrors of the market logic? Okay, so what I was saying is that this logic of the market, when they are shaping housing as a product, they reduce it to a generic product, which usually reproduces a specific way of life. And when we're researching and looking at it better, it's not natural, it's naturalized more than natural, which is this tripartite model that comes from the French bourgeois house from the 19th century, which is super compartmentalized. We didn't really have this idea of privacy inside housing until the 17th, 18th century in Europe. And we end up reproducing and legitimizing as architects this model in a way to reinforce it and naturalize it. Furthermore, I see that legislation has its advantages in the sense that it regulates and conceives urban parameters, because I think that market self-regulation would end up leading to even more precariousness in the cities. You can see this in the Baixada do Sete, because these markets always operate with the logic of maximum occupation and minimum parameters. If we're talking about opening or the height of the ceiling. So legislation ends up protecting, in certain senses, they end up protecting environmental and landscape quality of the city and minimum comfort. But on the other hand, they also reproduce the market logic, the hegemonic way of life logic. We couldn't make it here in Belo Horizonte to approve 100% open building project in which we don't have a defined kitchen or bathroom, or we have a very hard time of defining an open facade system in which the resident could actually choose the kind of opening or closing without having an actually pre-designed project. So in the first open buildings in the Netherlands, they had to have a concession from the state to produce these buildings because they didn't fit in the law. So I think the most important thing for us to discuss is up to which point is what we're doing really outside the law because it's below the minimum adaptability conditions, or because we're trying to take advantage and increasing the occupation, or is what we're trying to do overcoming, going beyond what the law demands. So maybe we could have an instance for discussion and reviewing this legislation when it was benefiting the resident.
Discussions in our regulatory organs, for example, to discuss architecture and understands it as a process, values this discussion and brings the architect to a more political and agent-laden subject. This discussion by Carolina is really interesting. I really loved her discussion that she brought to a course with that Denise. I tried to bring this to some clients, especially in the building of their dwellings, of their homes. The result is really interesting, especially when we try not to bring about technical norms. It's interesting, like when the clients themselves try to represent specific elements, and how sometimes when they spatialize their demand, they are able to understand what they really want or they don't want. I think that's it from me. Thank you so much. I'm going to be, I need to leave, so I'll be listening to you on my headphones. Maura, the floor is yours. Thank you for your reflections. I think we could chat for a whole evening or maybe 3 days. There's so much to be discussed. In France and in Europe, especially in France, they have a lot more evolution in terms of how to relate with what already exists. In France, they have a systematization of diagnostic processes for interventions in existing buildings. It's wonderful. It's spectacular. So they don't make things rigid. I would have to discuss our legislation in those terms because it's very rigid. It's very important to have legislation, of course. When we started having certain parameters in the law, it helped us, of course, but we don't have legislation for intervention in current buildings. We don't have one because there's one that's not valid anymore. I don't think we should have like a new sector in City Hall to analyze these buildings. We have to think about a sector that is able to assess in a customized way each building, because they're very different, each one of them. They were built in different periods, and this discourages new uses when you don't have legislation that where which guides these interventions. The state of Rio de Janeiro has some new legislation. Of course, you need accessibility, safety from fire hazards, etc. But you need to be able to find adaptations. You can't, for example, have an old building be completely in pace with the current legislation. So there's the issue of demolition. Apparently 2/3 of the owners can approve a demolition. But for a place to become mixed use, you would need everyone to approve. So these are anachronisms. What you spoke about, Jorge Tanuri, I don't know, but some things that I work that I analyze in my dissertation, we need to have the public offices to have agency, but I ask for a reflection of society. For example, you talked about Fundo Fika, the Fika Fund. It's a beautiful example that should be followed. São Paulo has had a longer track record of being concerned with the downtown area. So there are other groups beyond the big developers, entrepreneurs. For example, the Escola da Cidade, the city school, that's how it started. The creator went past the building, saw it, sought after the building owner. The building owner had no interest. That, if there wasn't, the building owner didn't care less. They have a lot of real estate. So you need society to want to intervene and do this and carry out these projects. The project in the occupation, Cláudia Pires, the Carolina occupation that you commented, and Anastasiak, they had a big problem. They tried to have a lower ceiling height, and they would really multiply living spaces, but City Hall didn't allow it. The city government was not aware of the needs of the community, and so I think we have two possibilities. The government and the society. Yes, the society can't leave this only in the hands of the government. I'll allow Carol to say something. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions. Yeah. Fernando has followed my processes for a long time, and I follow your processes, and they're really amazing. I think they're very interesting experiences that we can incorporate. A very significant issue for me in the process of my dissertation writing, and after that, is exactly the discussion of the teaching of architecture. I noticed in my process that I had to go all the way back to very initial issues, and we weren't able to advance into other forms of understanding, not just the place, but the people who are a part of the place, which is obviously essential to the understanding of place. Perhaps in the professional practice, this is more possible, because I'm very familiarized with these processes. This comes to me very naturally. Maybe it's possible, but in teaching, we still have a stranglehold, not only about the logic of what architecture training has become, the time that's made available for discussion. The courses are very focused on product that are going to be shown on social media for the university as a means of publicity for the course of the university. not based on the processes of the students. So I think this issue, which I have been paying attention to, not only in the Federal University of Minas Gerais, but in my own teaching practice, is exactly the university as a whole. Teachers still not reinforcing the idea of the place of people. Of course, there are so many ways of projecting. There's not just one procedure. Each case is a case, but the place of the person should be central. And in many processes, they are guided by a modernist concept, an object, an architectonic object that loses I think that is a path. We have a lot to trail on this path, not just in teaching, but in practice. And definitely I will be researching this experience. I want to know more about it. Denise, would you like to say something? No, go ahead. About Marina's question, just complementing what Rodrigo said, of course, legislation brings us important parameters, urban parameters, there's accessibility. These are important and necessary legislation. And even in the process of qualification of the spaces, I don't know the answer, but I understand in my personal point of view is that the guidelines of Belo Horizonte sometimes go against the market itself. So I don't know how it's going to be, this process. But I see there are advancements, and maybe in a few years we'll be able to see these small wins in the guidelines, including progressive property taxes. So simplified processes for constructions which are unfinished. Maybe there would be a sector that could be analyzed, but it's important to have these parameters that make viable for the conclusion of unfinished works, unfinished buildings. So I see we have some instruments. We know that the situation of the market is very complicated right now. So we see there is a power struggle in the process of the establishment of these guidelines. I hope I don't have answers. I hope that in some years we'll be able to see if these instruments, the city statutes, o Estatuto da Cidade, a federal legislation, I would like to see if we as architects working for the market or in our architecture firms, if we're able to insert a bit of qualification, if we're able to break with this logic, or if there will be a reversion of the logic to just the market demands. A lot in my work, we see the issue of in the guidelines for building, they're very restricted in terms of their view of the territory, but in a very summarized way, I think there are limitations. Some legislation is important, some legislation is a hindrance because of the excess of bureaucracy. I hope that in some years, small advancements in these guidelines will bring about some change. That's an expectation. I would like to thank people for their contributions and the opportunity to be here. I would like to...
Before we close off, I'm going to make some very brief comments. I've tried to not comment, but I always have to comment. So Marina mentioned a few things which I think it's important for me to mention. First, in relation to the way the people are connected to a given piece of real estate as something very determinant. We've seen this in practice throughout these 13 years, that it is a very important thing. When we go to favelas, villages and favelas where there's not actual ownership, but you have a certain security as far as the institutionalized recognition. But when we go to urban occupations where there's no ownership and no safety and no institutional recognition from the state, or when we go to peripheral areas where we don't have recognition from the state, we have a contractual fragility which allow for more or less self-construction stability from the point of sense, not only from the point of view, not only of the building itself, but from the political point of view. On the other side, we have formal residences, as we say, where there is ownership, there is safety, and there is the institutionalized recognition from the state. So have no doubt, the different kinds of ownership or connection to the real estate change the decisions of the owner, and this has to do with the time of ownership. And the other comment that I'd like to make about what Marina has mentioned has to do with a change in laws that happen in relation to the demands that is put by entrepreneurs, but this doesn't happen through architects. Why? Because we are playing a game of interests, Marina and everyone else. And who's playing in this game? Architects should theoretically have another role with political capital, but this political capital was not built in our field of knowledge. The proposing architect, this needs to be built, even though we have certain examples, specific examples. We don't have this education for proposing architects. We have the education for architects that solve problems and demands that arrive to us at our door. And the same logic is also there for the construction of public policies. The public policies are still a field of battle, and it should in fact be something else. However, in the current moment, it is a response to demands that are placed by the association between the state and capitalism. And our criticism has to do with how architecture is inside this, and this will be for another day of discussion, which will probably be mentioned in the 6th day, next Monday, in which we'll have a discussion called Occupying the City. So I'd just like to make these two brief comments to close up. Maculan, thank you so much for your contribution, your generosity in participating, and your generosity in listening, and in bringing critiques to our work, not only individually, but in our work as a group, as a collective. I think we always have open doors for conversations with our external partners. So I'd like to thank you immensely. I'd like to thank Maura, Carol, and Rodrigo. I'd also like to thank the interpreters, Jogo and Simone. If you want to say something, Maculan, before we go ahead. Finally, I'd just like to thank all of you. I'm the one who's winning and a lot from hanging out with you. No, we're all winning a lot. We're all getting a lot. This is the role of the university outreach, and even provoking this kind of different education of architect that proposes, which is another point, from my point of view at least, is something very important and needed within the undergraduate architecture courses. So I'm going to ask Flavio to finish our transmission, and I'd like to thank you all for your presence and for watching us on YouTube. And I'd like to invite you all. We have 2 more days of the seminar in the next 2 Mondays. And on next Monday, we're going to be talking about occupying the city. Thank you so much. Flavio, please. Good afternoon. Let's wrap up.
Recording stopped.
Obrigada.